All right. Next up for the 111 release managers, Louis and Kevin. I think for the we were trying to see if we can get someone more experienced from Google or Red Hat to help Ryan and Steve here. Do we have a third candidate?
Sorry, not yet.
All right.
Yeah, I still need to chase that up.
That's fine. Just let us know when you do.
Will do, thanks.
Yep. CNI beta graduation doc. Peter, I did look at it. It's really well written, and I liked it. Do you want us to review it now or just?
Yeah, just for offline review. Yeah. Please take a look and give feedback and see if there's anything missed.
Yeah, I think it's really nice. All the aspects are well covered, and I look forward to seeing it implemented. So I'll move on with the agenda unless there's anything else that someone wants to discuss. Is Costin here? I moved your agenda item to the top because it was left last time. So do you want to take it over, Costin?
The proxy config. Yes, can you click the link, actually, since you're presenting?
Yes.
So environments and networking working groups, we discussed this. Remember, POC asks us to promote the alpha APIs, and we picked proxy config because it has the largest and broadest usage, and it's probably most useful. We went over all the fields in proxy config, and we found a number of fields that are either no longer in use, probably are not very critical, or are deprecated, or are internal and don't make sense to expose as an API. And we ended up with a relatively small set of fields that we believe could be supported and should be promoted to beta. In the process, we discussed the relation between proxy config and sidecar, and how there is a bit of overlap, and the proposal is to actually take some fields from sidecar, like export and other things that are critical, and also add them to proxy config. And same for some annotations or values.yaml or things that were currently spread all over the place that are probably belong in proxy config or are related to proxy config, which we should also add to proxy config instead of the current alpha places. And there are a lot of comments. The doc is after more comments, I'll rewrite it to kind of reflect the comments. But I think we are pretty close to consensus, at least in those working groups, about moving forward with creating the CRD and at least the core part of the proposal.
So what is the difference between sidecar and proxy config?
Proxy config can also apply to gateways, including Kubernetes gateways, but not really different. I mean, one of the discussions was to just add everything to sidecar. The problem was that name is weird, and a lot of things in sidecar are very rarely used, like the white box mode, while the things in proxy config are frequently used. So the idea was that eventually sidecar would not be promoted to beta towards stable, and we would
sidecar only. Is sidecar only alpha today?
No, it is beta 1. It is beta 1, but we could treat proxy config as beta 2 or kind of. So we are not trying to remove sidecar. God forbid. I mean, it's just that it will be easier for users to. I mean, we duplicate a bit of functionality, like the egress. It's an opportunity to clean up a bit the semantic and the naming for the visibility stuff, which is the most useful part of sidecar. And the rest will be only for advanced users.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of wondering, like, semantically what the difference we want there to be, if there should be difference, or if we're getting rid of one and favor the other. It sounds like we're kind of getting rid of config, I mean, sidecar, or no?
I think sidecar, it's still useful for the use cases where advanced use cases where people don't use IP tables and need to specify UDP port or UDS or other things that are some advanced features that we need to support because.
So
I guess what I'm trying to get at is if we're going to have, we need to have very clear semantics for them, right? It needs to be really clear to the user what one is for and what the other is for, and what the dividing line is, and also for developers, right? So they know what is where.
So far, a sidecar is related to like routing, and proxy config is largely not, right? Is that the difference at least today?
No. Sidecar is also. I mean, again, one of the proposals that we discussed, and we are pretty much close to agreement, except for the name, was to just put everything in sidecar. The problem was, first of all, that gateways would also use proxy config. And second was that a lot of things in sidecar are very arcane and specific to very narrow use cases. Yes.
I think what Sven and Mandal both are trying to say is also what we discussed, right? We totally understand that there are overlapping semantics here. The issue is sidecar is a better API, but sidecar is very confusing, if that's the right word. At least for me it is, and I've heard many other users express that. And the most used functionality in the sidecar, like Austin is saying, is just to do config pruning via your egress visibility. So we can't do much about deprecating those fields and the complication with sidecar. So if you move it one way from proxy config to sidecar, you might make the problem worse. So we are looking for better, cleverer solutions here, because I totally agree, having two things is confusing, but both of us, and at least John, who we talked with, I mean, we don't have better ideas. Merging everything into one just feels like a big API, which will be even more confusing to our consumers.
And to be honest, I mean, I'm perfectly okay with merging them. I mean, I think there are trade-offs, but I agree with Niraj. It will be better. I mean, I think the plan we came up, it's cleaner for the user because they can focus on proxy config. And sidecar will be, yes, then we need clear documentation, I agree. But
for the developers too, right? We have to have guidance, which is what I'm a little worried about too, right? So is sidecar more or less like a zombie API then? You don't put
advanced user. I mean, we still need the functionality for white box if we want to support it for the 1% of users who need it.
Well,
no, I meant.
I want to chime in. One of the common user cases with sidecar is visibility, right? To be able to config the visibilities of our Istio resources, I think that's like a very common thing, and we recommend user to do that in production environment. So that really feels more like proxy config to me. Especially, we also talk about moving the outbound traffic policy to proxy config from the call the other day.
Yes, Lynn, I mean, I totally agree with you. That's why we are proposing it, but we still don't have a good answer for Sven's question, right? So we have semantic overlap. How do you make sure developers understand new fields where they go?
Right, and is there any, what is the long-term goal, right? Is the long-term goal to have two or one? If it's to have one, then there has to be a strategy for getting rid of one of them, right?
And I'm saying we can't, that's the problem.
Well, so it's fine. I think it's totally fine if we decide the right solution is two. It's just, yeah, you have to have that very clear semantics of what they're for.
Yep, agreed.
Like maybe I could imagine something like, if we were starting from scratch, you'd have proxy config and advanced proxy config or something, right? Like you could have two. There's right, series are cheap. It's just we need to know what to do.
Yeah, if we move the visibility and the outbound traffic policy from sidecar to proxy config, it almost feels to me the sidecar for that whatever 1% user custom you mentioned, that's really like an advanced proxy config, like Sven mentioned. Maybe if we can position that way so that we can move the common attributes to proxy config. So most 99% user will just using one API eventually.
I like it.
Sorry, John and Louis have hands raised. Let's use this. John.
Go ahead. John.
Right. So yeah, one other reason why it's good to have another resource, I think, is that the merging semantics of proxy config and sidecar are planned to be different. And so, I mean, I suppose we could say these new fields have a different merge than the old fields, but it may be a bit confusing. But with proxy config, we definitely need merging so that you can do things like set mesh-wide defaults like you can today, like discovery address. That's very unlikely to be set on a per pod basis. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it.
What are the merging semantics of sidecar, or is it that there aren't any?
There are none.
My sort of initial reaction to that is that we should not have different merging semantics, right? Like we should be consistent. It's really confusing to users to not be. So
yeah,
like we should move towards consistency as a project, just in general on what merging semantics. But yeah, noted that they're different today.
So I guess two things. So I guess long-term sidecar will be deprecated by Gateway, correct?
That's the intent,
John.
If,
right. So we're not as concerned by the survivability of sidecar necessarily as an API because it has an impending replacement. Costa and John, what do we think the likely difference is between proxy config and gateway class?
For gateway, I kind of expect gateway will disappear, replaced by Kubernetes gateway.
No. I mean gateway class.
Oh, gateway class. Oh, gateway class is a cluster-wide configuration for.
Well, I think there's some debate now about whether it's actually cluster-wide or not.
True. Yes, that could, but again, the class has inside the kind of a custom field, which is proxy config in reality. So if it
yes,
was
that's why I'm asking, right?
Yes, we'll put proxy config inside that proxy class as a configuration if they go this way.
So when we say inside, what do we mean in terms of structuring the API?
That the class configuration, however, the class specific configuration will be represented. The content will be proxy config. So I don't know if they will have a reference to proxy config or it will be in line. But the semantics we need for configuring that particular class, if we go the way where you're saying, then that seems to be very close to.
Right. It's just worth noting that gateway class is referred. Right. It's not a reverse workload binding to attach.
That's also true.
So we need to figure out how we're going to do that composition.
Quick question here, Louis.
Or what was that, Neeraj?
So while I agree that intent should be that sidecar API gets replaced or consumed by gateway class, currently some of the configuration we provide at the sidecar API level, it doesn't feel like gateway classes will ever provide it, especially around.
Not gateway class. Sidecar should get replaced by gateway if it's, as you know, one of the semantic divisions is routing or capture concerns. Because those. Whereas proxy config, which talks about kind of, or a bunch of kind of runtime properties of the proxy, that's more like a gateway class. It's not, right? There's obviously API impedance between the two right now with gateway class nominally being a cluster-wide CRD, but I don't think that's going to hold.
But some of the interception mechanisms that we have in sidecars, do you think it applies to gateways if they're running in standalone mode? Because that's what it feels like gateways currently target, right?
Gateway has the, right, as people have mentioned, most of what sidecar is used is for dependency pruning. Gateway can express that. The other thing is capture. I think a gateway can also express that with its address type. So between those two things, I think we're okay to allow gateway to replace sidecar for, you know, what Custom was describing as white box mode. Right. So then Proxy config is relevant for both gateway and sidecar use cases. Gateway class and proxy config have a similar conceptual model, but there are some structural issues today that we need to resolve.
I see.
But in practical terms, creating a CRD with a most conservative set of fields that are currently not duplicated and not confusing, and promoting this, from alpha to beta, should be, reasonable at this point. I think it's not.
As long as we have a reasonable answer for how gateway class and proxy config are going to relate, I think then we have a reasonable answer overall.
And the vendor extensions are supported by the Kubernetes. I mean, I'm concerned about the visibility rules because we want to have them in Kubernetes as well. So a particular subset of proxy config probably will be overlapping, I think. But I don't know any.
If we move it from sidecar to proxy, so let's talk about that, right?
Yeah.
Right. So with gateway, right? Gateway custom gateway will be able to reference service, right? Directly.
Yes.
So that is a visibility rule, a means to express the same visibility rule capability.
True, but in the mesh side, I don't think we solve this problem. I think the current proposal is to not have a gateway for each workload.
That's the default.
Yeah. I'm okay to not move it now. I mean, let's just start with the rest, and because it's not adding any particular earth shaking. I mean, we already have a way to put it in sidecar, and we can postpone it for next release or later to move the visibility. And frankly, everything else, I mean, that you feel.
Another good question here is then, do we want a new CRD if eventually something else is coming along to replace it, right? And I know we have talked about it for a long time, but this might be again a good time to bring it up.
I don't think the gateway will ever fully replace this. I mean, these are Istio specific things. There's never going to be a Kubernetes API that says discovery address, for example. Now, there may be a new API that references proxy config, but we don't need the resource. And I don't have my hopes up that proxy config will ever actually replace this. So I don't want to stall forever. Gateway class, I think, is fairly flawed with the cluster scope.
Yeah, templates for injection, controlling injections, there are all kinds of fields that are very specific to Istio implementation. And
yeah, no, I would just like to have an answer about how we expect gateway class and proxy config to work together.
Yeah.
Hopefully, gateway class gives up on being a concrete type and becomes a controller interpreted type reference. That would be better, correct, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be my preference. And it seems possibly the direction things are going.
We kind of do have an answer because proxy config is in broad use and we are using it currently with Git. I mean, it's just internal and alpha. It's not nothing changes basically. We keep compatibility with exactly what we have today until we have to change it.
So the difference is that right now, proxy config is either directly workload bound or mesh bound through mesh config, default config. And now we're just aligning it with all the other APIs. So
yes. And the main reason is, I mean, the two reasons. One is to have validation and also, consistency with the rest of the APIs. But also an important use case that Niraj mentioned, I mentioned in the doc, if you have programmatic creation of pods, the current mechanism of putting an annotation doesn't work because it will require code changes the code. And having a CRD with selector would allow us to configure those use cases. Or in general, things that are not necessarily pods where you can put an annotation.
So, I mean, from what I can see, it feels like ProxyConfig CRD might be a good choice here. Naming, we will have to bike share a bit, just because these all things sound similar and it should be clear to the user. For moving the config pruning pieces from sidecar to proxy config, it doesn't look like we have consensus, but I do want to talk more about it. Louis, if we add proxy config as a separate CRD and still we don't move the config pruning configuration, we will have to have users now configure two things instead of one.
Well, do most users, right? We're still going to have a global default for proxy config, correct?
Yeah, and outbound traffic
Yes.
policy is a good example for that, right? So they are going to need to config global one for that, and if they need to overwrite, they would have to. They could use proxy config for workload, or they could do sidecar.
So what is there a different form of config pruning that we expect to have other than referencing a list of services through routes? Or the third option, right, where services are, their visibility is declared, like the inverted model.
And the proposal to have IAM drives this. I mean, RBAC rules and other things derive it from there, which is still debated.
Or derive it from network policy.
Yeah.
I mean, the last two options basically are interesting, but don't. I mean, the last option is if the user has created those policies, but if they have not, they still might want config pruning, right? So we will need to have a fallback. The third option about service annotations, is it being floated in Kubernetes now, Louis?
It's come up. It hasn't gotten traction yet.
Yeah. When you say annotations, do you really mean annotations, or do you just mean decorations via some other mechanism?
The ability to it. So the one thing that is getting traction is the standardization of policy attachment to the different resources in the model. One of those policies could be visibility, right? And therefore you could do policy attachment that way.
Got it.
And the other tools, network policy and IAM RBAC, are nice because they you know, it's the user sets something that is enforceable.
Right. So that's.
I think that's an optimization, right?
Well, security fix, I would say, but yeah, optimization.
Right. I mean, you have already told us who you want to talk to, so why will we send you config more than that?
Exactly. So can we move ahead with at least the bare bone and then have individual discussions for visibility? I mean, as we get more data, so we don't get stuck in alpha.
I would like to know more about that, just because it's weird to now ask users to configure multiple things. I'm just saying, it's going to be confusing.
Sure, but we can create the CRD, put all the infrastructure in place, write the code with the bare bone that it currently exists. I mean, there is no change, just alpha to beta, and in parallel work on individual fields that we may want to promote, demote, move. Incremental progress, basically.
So I think it's reasonable to create proxy config to have the fields that's not conflict with anything inside sidecar resource, right? Like the discovery selector, hold the application until app ready. I mean, these are not covered in sidecar, so there's no contention. So those are seems reasonable. I think people definitely are worried about it. They are also in sidecar resource. So which way is user going to do, and how are we going to resolve conflict? So I'm not sure on those.
Sure. I mean, let's separate the problem. Alpha promotion to beta for things that are spread across the entire sync and solve this problem first, maybe, and then how to optimize other things. Nothing that I'm proposing in this is new or doesn't exist. It's just fields that are alpha in different places and are not configurable with the right.
Right. So I think I'm okay with that. The only structural thing with the API that needs to be resolved before we do that is proxy config and gateway class, because we don't want to create structural impedance mismatch when and if we make a transition from sidecar API to gateway API, which will happen within this timeline. There's certainly no reason in the long run for sidecar API not to be deprecated with the existence of this and the gateway API, right? Because gateway API, to Sven, your question about semantic swim lanes, gateway API is very clearly traffic routing and traffic capture. So that isn't going to change. So there's a very clear division of capabilities and requirements between the two APIs. Proxy config and gateway will have to coexist, right? So we have to figure out how they coexist. And gateway class is interesting because gateway class doesn't have a workload selector, right? And so the gateway use case, in particular, we're going to have to decide between whether we want proxy config selecting gateway workloads, or gateway classes are selected by gateways, either directly or indirectly, right? That has to be resolved because it's a structural concern. Now that gets resolved, John, I think, if gateway class is allowed to be synthetic. It doesn't if it's not. Does that sound right to everybody? Or at least specifically
Louis,
to John, because John is spending the most time on this.
Yeah. Before he jumps in, how would you define the configurations that's housed in gateway classes, and why do you think they map well to proxy config?
They're generally speaking runtime behaviors of the gateway instance that are being described, right? Whether, for any given implementation, you might say, well, here's how many instances I want, or how much CPU or resources, right? So things that look like injection. There are also policies, right, about the behavior of the gateway, right? It's very open-ended, but it's not traffic related. So it's everything but traffic that's being described.
I see. So we should be able to use this guidance, right, as in future, which config belongs then.
Right. So like proxy config, right, is everything but traffic for the same reason. Right. So the gateway class and proxy config are logically the same thing.
We didn't follow it like that, but yeah, I think we did deviate a few times.
Right, and if we're going to put a workload selector into proxy config, then we have to reconcile with how gateway class is bound. Now, for mesh, I think that's easy. For actual gateways, it's a little harder. We need a clear answer.
So we need to figure out how do we attach. I mean, if we continue to use workload selector for attachment, or do we use the reference, basically in proxy config? That's a fundamental question.
Right, and why would you allow overlapping selector on gateway instances, right? Things like that.
So an alternative would be something like the canonical service or some other form of reference that can be referenced.
Or you can just literally reference a proxy config resource as the gateway class, which is the thing.
True, but one use case is you have an unmodified pod, and the pod starts up. You reference from what? I mean, it's
no. For pod, I think it's fine, right? You need the workload selector. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think the issue only arises on actual gateways.
Yes. So I understand your concern here. So we may need something in addition to workload selector. Workload selector is needed anyway for pods, but we may need something else to. Okay.
And so then the other thing, the default proxy config is a referenced resource out of mesh config.
Right now, yeah.
Okay, that seems reasonable. and referenced and not inlined, correct?
Currently, it's inline, right?
Well, we would have to stop doing that, right? Or we should stop doing that. Otherwise, why you have the same API twice, Niraj, and when you make mesh config into a CRD, you'll.
I get it. I don't know how the deprecation path here works. That's a lot of churn on users.
Okay, but I get that we can't do that overnight. But Costin, is the intent to make those two schemas agree completely?
We are flexible. As long as we remove the alpha and achieve the goals, I'm open to any suggestion.
All right. Well, you have to include that in your plan, right? What the intent is to do with mesh config.
Yeah. I mean, my intent was to just deprecate everything. I mean, mesh config remains alpha and will gradually die, and proxy config will be the one that is, complete separate resource. I mean, mesh config is moving to kind of operators managing Istio and
Well, it's okay if mesh config becomes trivially small. Like that's fine. Proxy config should. That doesn't mean that proxy config should take over everything that mesh config did, correct?
Absolutely.
Right. There are still like things that dictate the behavior of the control plane.
Yeah.
Right.
Do they need to refer at all? Louis?
Well, if proxy config is inline in mesh config, right? Which do we consider the resource for revisions?
The proposal is if it is in line and there is no explicit CRD, then we use backward compatibility mode. If user is starting to creating an explicit CRD, then we ignore the alpha stuff, and because user implicitly opted into beta.
Right, but that doesn't mean that we ignore mesh config.
No. The mesh config, except the proxy config inside mesh config will be ignored in this case because again we want the validation and all the other stuff. We may keep it for backward compatibility or for transition or for other things. I mean that's open, but in the end we want to be in a state where there is no proxy config in mesh config, because.
Okay, so if this proposal is saying that we're going to take proxy config out of mesh config.
Yep, gradually, slowly.
Okay, and you're saying if both exist in this Istio system namespace, we're going to take proxy config by default.
Yep.
Right, as the system-wide default.
Yep.
Our general pattern has been for control plane-wide defaults, they would become referenced resources out of mesh config. Because mesh config still represents the root configuration for a given control plane instance. Correct?
Right.
So what remains in mesh config once you do that?
And once we move mesh config to beta, that's the other step set.
Which, sure, right? And mesh config is not even a CRD.
Exactly.
So the document needs to just explain what's going to happen for that.
Okay, I can take a stab at this. It's not. It may be controversial, but at least we can discuss it.
Yeah, so just make sure we're on the same page. So basically, mesh config is per revision, right? So there are configuration that's control plane specific, like CA address. It's going to be unique for different revisions. So you could have your own mesh config from 110 to 111. But proxy config, the customer resource that's going to be created, is going to be global across different revisions on the cluster. Is that how you envision? Okay, thanks.
But like all other areas, like gateway and all the destination rule and everything else.
Right, so it's revision independent.
Yeah.
And mesh config is also kind of becoming revision independent with the option we added where we're gonna have a mesh config that is user managed, which is cross revisions, which is merged with the developer.
Okay, because you have merge. Okay. Yeah, John, I'm not actually trying to tie mesh config beta to proxy config beta. I just want to have a basic understanding of what we expect the evolution path to be. I'm going to have to do the work, right? So I just want to see the design part.
One more request from me. Sorry, Louis, go ahead.
Yeah, so the only special thing here, obviously, is the global default still being tied into mesh config, right? Can still cause a big shift in which proxy config is bound for a workload when you do revision traversal, which is okay, because that's the same for other resources, but it's going to be important to make that clear to people.
But do you have strong opposition to the current proposal to just say if you have the beta resource is in charge, otherwise we fall back to legacy and use legacy one?
I would prefer that we had an explicit resource reference out of mesh config, but I don't have a specific objection to that as a transition path.
Okay. So when mesh config moves to beta, if it moves to beta, then we definitely will add the reference, and that actually is a pretty good idea for.
Well, I think you're going to want the reference anyway, even if you're not moving mesh config to beta.
I see.
But
So
we can.
I see. So basically, each revision could have a different default. Yeah, actually, that's not a bad idea. That's we can do that.
That's where I was going. Like, aren't the users losing things because proxy config is no longer version tied? If we do what Louis just said, we will still support that behavior.
Yes, and I agree with what I mean. Yes, that's something we should add to the document and make it happen. Yeah.
But
like per namespace proxy config, per namespace proxy config instances can select on labels, right? That could be tied to revisions if people really wanted to do that all the way down at the leaf level.
And that's something we support. So that was my original thinking, that we use the Istio IRF that we can put on any label, including destination rule and whatever, to make it bound to a revision. It's something only people know about, but it exists. And I agree, it's not what Kubernetes is doing. And it's not what Kubernetes is doing. So I agree that we should probably consider replacing this with the explicit references in the new Kubernetes API model. But it's a kind of orthogonal discussion.
So quick question here. So do we want to continue down the path of Istio rev labels on any custom resources? Or is that going to be a thing that only 3 people know and no one else uses?
It's for advanced users for sure. The question is if we are going to replace it with what the attachment policy attachment model that Louis mentioned. And I think we should, but
cost in the issue. Issue is we will have two ways of doing things again. Right, because we can't remove the other one.
I agree. That's the reality of Kubernetes, new Kubernetes API we're adopting. I mean, there will be a broad, vendor neutral way to do things, and the Istio specific way. That's we cannot ask other vendors to use Istio IRF.
I mean, Kubernetes have been doing refs forever. It's not new, but yeah. So we should then deprecate the other. Eventually, we should deprecate Istio IRF. Is that what you and maybe Louis is also proposing, or not?
Yes, it is what I'm proposing. I mean, just like we're proposing deprecating sidecar, and when Kubernetes replacement is V1 or beta or not now.
But not for injector, right? This is only to deprecate the annotation on Istio resources.
Yes.
Honestly, I hope user doesn't have to use that annotation. It's really, really complicated.
And but for some cases, it's unavoidable. I mean, if it's a new feature that is only supported in a particular, I mean, that's like envoy filter. It's kind of, you cannot avoid it in some cases.
Okay, I think we did have a good discussion on this. We have one more topic. Are these questions captured here good for you, Costin? I think the ask will be to get answers for this in the document and ping us either asynchronously or bring it back to POC.
Okay, and to be clear, we can go ahead with creating the beta proto hidden from API and read it and make the code changes while we are in parallel addressing the other cases, because 1.11 is around the corner and probably to not be finished in 1.11, but at least I like to have some progress made.
So my one last comment is that if we can get some directional sense quickly about whether this is going to land in 1.11 or not, it will be very helpful. So if I guess if Costin gets these answers in a week, I think we should still try to have this approval by next week. Okay.
This is pretty impactful to users, by the way. I mean, we have tend to in history screwed up upgrades, and this will be one of those things, if not done correctly. So I would rather take some time to do it properly, even if we skip 1.11.
So I thought a bit about this in 1.11. I think what the most important thing for 1.11 from my perspective is to just go over all fields in proxy config, the existing proxy config, and put documentation saying, hey, this field is going to be part of the beta API and you can rely on it. And this field is, deprecated or hidden or you should not rely on it. And that will be impactful for users because at least they will have clarity of what exactly will be supported. And if we have agreement on some fields, they can make some decisions based on that, and then transition will be easier. I don't expect people to start using a new CRD in 1.11. I mean, I think if they just keep using the annotation, I will be very happy.
So should we start with beta? I'm sorry, alpha for 1.11. This is going to be a new API. It seems odd just claim beta.
Alpha with comments indicating the stability of the field, saying that this field is going to be promoted, or I don't know how we can express it. I was thinking to have a beta CRD, no, not CRD, proto at least, with a cleaned up version. But people will continue to use Alpha API with the fields that are documented as beta. At least that was my simplest plan to make progress and provide some value to the users in 1.11.
I'm good with that. How about others, Len, Louis, and Sven?
I mean, if we're going to spread across 2 releases, that certainly seems. I mean, really, what we're shipping in 1.11 is doc, right? So.
Yeah.
Doc and some fields moved from values.yaml and other places into proxy because that's part of this discussion, like proxy resources and.
But Costin, just to clarify, so in 1.11 we will not create a new CRD.
We might. I want the proto to be created. If we create a CRD, if we have all the elements in place, that's fine. But we'll not promote it or tell people to start using it in 1.11.
Okay,
we want to give more time.
As far as users are concerned, we're not creating a new CRD.
We're not creating. Yes.
So we're not going to create an alpha CRD for this.
A proto, yes, but I don't think even if we create its implementation as part of 1.12 work, kind of to spread the word, will not be documented basically. We'll not document in 1.11 that you can use this new resource until we have, and it gives us more practice and more feedback from users on how they feel about that.
I'm a bit confused. What does adding proto do if we don't have a CRD?
Yeah.
First of all, clarity on what fields are supported and not. Second, moving the other fields that are now in values.yaml into proxy config. And again, I'm not against adding the proxy CRD. It's just I don't know if we have time to do it right. And I would rather, I'm okay to have the CRD and some code that is using the CRD so we can test. And if it's perfectly working, then we'll document it. But I do not want to commit for 1.11 to the entire thing.
So I guess, Costin, the difference between having the API and recommending the use of the API, right? We could have the API in experimental.
Exactly.
With all the schematization and everything that you're describing. The difference between that and 1.12 would be migration tooling and upgrade support for users between those 2 states.
Yes.
Implementing the CRD itself is not particularly difficult. Implementing the migration is the much harder thing. Is that what you're suggesting we try and do for 1.11, or is that?
Yes.
the more reasonable, right? So we do have a CRD. It is experimental.
Beta experimental.
What's beta experiment?
There's no such state.
I was joking. Sorry. No, I meant we have the CRD, but we are not yet promoting documenting it as please use it or start using it. It's just we say that it's work in progress and
right. I mean that's what experimental means.
Yep. Which is reality. I mean, it's brand new, just added, fresh out of the oven.
Right. So the only thing one question there is, do we want it to be alpha because we want to progress it to beta very quickly?
Alpha 2 is fine too. We can do Alpha 2.
What do you think, Sven? Normally, if we don't want users to use it, we would probably keep it experimental. But it sounds like we're in something of a hybrid here.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's fine to do it in experimental or even alpha, honestly, because that's what those are for. I agree we should not go straight to beta, but I don't have a strong opinion on experimental versus alpha for 1.11.
Well, it is already alpha. It can be alpha 2. I mean, Proxy Config is not
Well, I mean, as a CRD.
Well, a CRD is, the content is what matters, and
right. But so still, if you introduce the CRD, you should not introduce it direct to beta.
Well, we did
so
it
my question is, what is the exact kind of feedback that we're looking for? Because the general shape is in use today. The override structure is also in use today, sans sort of the namespace scoping, which is missing. We have a mesh scope and a workload scope, so that is not changing. And then the thing that is happening is a cleanup of fields that have just accumulated. So I'm wondering, like, what kind of feedback are we looking from users here? It's not really a new API.
For me, I'm making sure that the upgrades actually work. And if you're saying it's a beta quality API, then the migration and the upgrade better be spot on. If you make it alpha or experimental, I think we can have some mishaps along the way.
John,
even if the API structure,
it
the
seems
API
like
structure doesn't change.
It seems like adding it as alpha doesn't really do anything. Like, it seems obvious that an API should go alpha, beta, stable, and skipping levels is wrong, but that's because that's how other projects are able to do it, because they have proper versioning. But for us, we can't change it anyways. So if we ship it as alpha, it might as well be called beta, because we can't remove any of the fields when we promote it anyways. So is there really any benefit of going to alpha first?
I think that's true today. That doesn't mean that's the long-term state of the project, right? We want to fix that. We actually want to fix that.
I don't think we'll fix it before we go to beta for proxy config, though.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Right, but John, we are able to have the same API in both alpha and beta, right? That we are capable of doing infrastructurally. As long as it's the same API.
We can't remove stuff if we add it in alpha. And we have to remove it from the alpha to remove it in beta.
And if
we just hide it from docs. That's what we do.
Yeah. And that
I
was
don't
going
think
to.
we can even do that, actually.
Yeah.
The schema has to be identical, like byte for byte identical. So.
And not only that, but if people start using alpha because they have cross versions, because they want to use it 1.11, they will put alpha label and will be stuck with alpha label forever, because, well, not forever, for 3 releases, basically. 2 releases.
That's the state currently, right?
Yes.
We also should have clear communication to users. While APIs can be available as both alpha API and beta API according to Kubernetes schema, our support for the feature probably should not be described as both alpha and beta.
Correct.
How about...
Go
ahead, Lee.
Yeah, I mean, literally the only thing we can do today between alpha and beta is hide things from docs if we actually built the feature to do that, which we haven't built. In many ways, that's already aligned with our, well, it's not quite aligned with our deprecation goals, as we would like to be able to deprecate alpha API features faster. But I think we're okay paying a schema compatibility cost, even if at runtime we drop support for fields and hide them from docs. Right, as long as we're comfortable with the shape, like the basic structure of the API, and don't have to make large structural changes, which it doesn't sound like we have that problem here.
How about next week we discuss again briefly to figure out. I mean, let me update the doc and answer those questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds
so
good.
Maybe ping people offline so we get the review sped up a bit.
Because if we keep delaying this, it answers the problem itself, because we'll not be able to have time to do it in 1.11. So it's.
Yeah.
No, and thanks for the doc. I mean, it's a lot of fields that you have to look at. All right. Lynn, were you saying something? Sorry.
No, I was just going to thank you, Costa.
Yeah. Well, we have 5 minutes, so let's discuss Brian's topic. I hope it's a quick one. Brian, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so this is quick. I've gotten requests from people to be able to use the release notes tooling in separate projects without actually pulling in the entire tools repo. So the only question here is for permission to create a separate repo. We've already discussed it in test and release.
Do we expect the repo to just be for release notes, or would other things also go in there, or could they, if they were release-related artifacts?
It's just related. It's just supposed to be the release notes tooling.
All right, so we wouldn't put SHAs or things like that in this repo.
Yep, that's correct.
Does that make sense? Is that right? There are other release-related artifacts. I don't want to have release notes and then release SHAs and then release XXX.
So this is the tooling so that you can pull the actual. So we've got the tool that creates the release notes, takes all of the files and it generates release notes from that. And the request here is to be able to pull in that tooling without pulling in the rest of the tools repo. So it's only for the command itself.
Oh, it's for the tool. Okay.
Okay, so just making sure. So when people submit a PR to Istio, if it has changes, if it needs to add something to the release notes, the PR still needs to check in the release notes file in the release notes dir. So that process remains unchanged even when we move. Okay, I'm good with that.
Can we just call it release notes tool then, or something to indicate? It confused me.
Yeah, that would be good.
Can you explain what problem this is solving? So what is it about pulling in the whole thing that was causing problems? Why do we need to do this?
So this is
just because we don't make a lot of repairs.
Sorry, continue.
Sorry. I was just saying generally don't like to create a lot of repos, so we should. I want to understand why we're.
Yeah. So this was specifically a request from Steve Dake. He likes the Istio release notes tooling. He wants to be able to use it in his project that he's working on now, but he doesn't want to pull in all of the Istio tools to be able to do it. So I was proposing it to a separate repo under the Istio organization.
That doesn't seem like a good reason to do it.
I agree. I thought it's
they should
for somebody for on the Istio community.
Yeah, they should just compile the binary. Like if I go, I don't get upset when kind adds dependencies because we don't have a Go dependency on them. We just use their binary, right? Same with kubectl or hundreds of other tools. It doesn't seem reasonable to expect that we have small dependencies for a binary tool.
Yeah, sorry.
This feels like a slippery
Brian,
slope.
I thought we wanted to do this for kind of internal reasons to the project, which if they were good enough, that would have been fine.
Yeah, that's technical. Okay.
Decision is nope.
Yep, that works for me. Thanks.
All right. This was indeed quick.
Good discussion. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Anything else? We have just 1 minute. If not, let's take 1 minute back.
Let's take a minute back.
All right.
Sounds good. Thanks. All.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks
Thanks, folks. Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
Bye.